Double check everything. Hello, all the multitude of live listeners that we have the world over. Maybe we'll get some comments today. That would be great. Welcome to the Canadian Philosophy Show. I'm Michael Robert Caditz, and I have two of my associates with me. I have two of my associates. Tagen Marshall of Vancouver Island University. Tagen, how are you, and what are you studying these days?
I am doing well, and what am I studying? Well, always gotta look at the existentialist point of view because, I'm just full of dread all the time. I'm right now working through some excerpts from Camus right now, and that's very enlightening. So it's always fun when you have to meditate on your own demise.
Yeah, I've never called it fun myself, but it's certainly thought-provoking and hopefully action-provoking, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't have forever, so I better do something now.
Mm-hmm.
And Nicole Kirigin of Fraser University. How are you, and how are your classes this semester?
Hi. Yeah, I'm doing well. Classes are okay. Online teaching and learning is a difference, but you gotta take what you can from it. I'm studying psychology and philosophy at Fraser University.
And are you a double major, or?
Yeah.
And which one is your preference going forward, or do you have one?
My to try to go into something that allows me to be interdisciplinary and use ideas from different disciplines. So I am considering grad school in both psychology and philosophy, and ideally my end position would be where I have academic freedom to integrate different ideas from different disciplines. That's my goal, and that's my dream.
Oh, great. So I understand that you have chosen a topic for today, and I would love for you to introduce it.
Yeah, I'm really happy that we're able to talk about this topic. So I wanted to talk about the topic of interpersonal communication. And I think that the talking about interpersonal communication and how to best approach interpersonal communication is very important and a pertinent topic in light of our societal things that are happening, like with politics and with communication and with the social media. I think that more than ever, we really do need to consider appropriate ways in communicating with each other in order to get all our needs met and all our goals met. So I think I have really enjoyed reading Martin Buber, and I really enjoy his book I and Thou, and I've used it throughout my time in university to think about how I'm communicating with each other, with other people, and I think that we can use the his teachings in order to inform our communication. So Martin Buber, his book I and Thou discusses the difference between communication that is objectifying and personifying. So he brings up, the main difference is I-it style, which he argues that in his time, people mainly talk to each other in an objectifying sense, trying to find ways that they can use other people for their own goals and their own benefit. And he advocates for a method of communication that personifies other people and sees them as a person that they truly are, and does not try to find a way to use other people for their own, like, as a means to an end. So Martin Buber tries to use, this is a term you often talked about in ethics, but Martin Buber argues that I-it communication is using people as a means to an end and not an end in themselves. And he argues that that is unethical to try to objectify people, and he actually talks about objects and other things in the world as well in terms of this, but we will mainly focus about interpersonal communication.
Great. Yeah, it makes sense to understand some of the theory that Buber articulates as a way of leading into the actual practical aspects of a new way of communicating interpersonally, which creates more understanding and meets needs more and entails less violence. Violence, perhaps in the literal sense, but also in the figurative sense. I hear so many people, even if they're not physically hurting each other verbally, attacking each other and yelling at each other and talking past each other. So I'm really curious to find out what you're going to bring to the table here, Nicole, and also Tagen with your understanding of Buber, because I think there's a relationship from what I can tell between what Buber talks about and wrote about and this idea that there's a way of communicating nonviolently. And indeed, I've been learning some nonviolent communication skills, and I can see how they're related to Buber's I and thou principles, so that'll probably come out during the show. Yeah. What do you think, Tagen?
What do I think about what?
The relationship between the theory, the I and thou theory, which I'm sure we'll go into more, and the ability to actually communicate more effectively with people.
Right. Well, yeah. Before I answer that, I think, Nicole, we were discussing off air just the different phrases that Martin Buber uses to describe certain circumstances. Would you like to briefly define those for us so our listeners know what we're discussing?
Yeah. So Martin Buber mainly differentiates between the concept of I-it and I-thou. However, he also brings up other ways that we can talk to each other in I-it methods. So I-it is so I is the you, the yourself, and then the next thing after the dash there is a thing that you're trying to communicate with. So when he's saying I-it, is you are communicating with the other person as an object. You're seeing them as an it. You're seeing them as something that can be used in a certain way. And perhaps you could argue that maybe if you see a rock and you need to, if you want to skip the rock across the water, you could see it as an I-it, as an object for something that you want to do. So you say, okay, this is an object for me to be able to throw it across the water. And in that way, you could say, sure, that is possibly appropriate. Although Buber does talk about inanimate objects later on in his book. But when we're talking about people, I believe that it is, and Buber also states that it is a less ethical way of talking to people, because you are trying to find a way that you can use them, and you're not seeing the person behind the means that they could be towards your end. But then he expands on I-it, and he talks about ways that you could see other people in I-it ways. So there's us versus them, or I or us them. So that is trying to other people. So it's the act of othering, trying to say, okay, this is us. We are one group. We are a good group, and then there's the other group, and then trying to I guess devalue whatever they are doing because they're different. And then there's I-we, and that is kind of a stereotypical, I guess, communist way of looking at things, but it's he doesn't really talk about communism per se, but it's more of the idea of taking away personal identity. So when you're looking at people as a collective, then you're not looking at them as a person or as an individual, and that is what he does recommend is a better way of communicating with people. And then after that, with those considerations, he talks about I thou, and I thou is a way of connecting with people in a manner that respects their humanity, respects them as a person, respects them as an individual, and it goes beyond what they can just offer to you, but it also looks at their needs as a human being and their unique needs, because not everybody has the same needs as well. So that is kind of the gist of his philosophy, at least the main arguments. But he is known to go into more spiritual understandings because he is considered a religious philosopher. But he does have some, like, for example, the I, it, I, thou, those conceptions can definitely be seen separately from his religious understandings.
Thanks, Nicole. So with that in mind, I can more accurately answer the question of interpersonal communication, how I see interpersonal communication. I'm in a bit of a unique position. Being a person with a disability offers me the ability to witness, in a sense, and it's very unintentional, but in a sense there is this kind of I-it communication which can occur when I'm interacting with individuals primarily of a older demographic, a different time period in that sense, where they will take note of my physical limitations and by virtue make the automatic assumption that I then lack the mental ability to carry on a conversation. I'll give you one quick example of an I-it type thing or an assumption that was made, which was a failure in communication. One afternoon, I was sitting at a Chapters connected with a coffee shop, and this fellow sat down next to me, and we started talking about just who we were, what we did, and he found out that I had a passion for writing. So he said, "Oh yeah, you should write." And he said, I'm sure you have tons of time." That was the assumption, that because I'm disabled, I have tons of time. Well, when I said, well, actually, I'm a philosophy major, that's not quite the case. His eyes went wide, and he wasn't quite sure what to do with that. So it's a good question how we do interpersonal relationships and communication, because I think we see in I thou, right, there is a reciprocation between two people. The interaction is reciprocal. Mm-hmm. Because you are stating your needs, what you are feeling, what you are thinking, what you're experiencing, but you're also willing and open to a dialogue between. In a sense, I think it's a dialogue between the two hearts of the individuals, because I think you could argue that it goes much deeper than the physical world can understand. In a sense, it reaches to the very core of that person to see what they need. I think it's very important. I think with COVID, we have seen the best of people, we have seen the worst of people. And when we're under stress, it is far more common to see, the qualities of a person when put under pressure. So I think this is important, because how do we enter into philosophical discussions and respectfully disagree with each other, even if we have drastically, maybe even emotionally charged viewpoints on things? how do we enter into the political arena and present our ideas, but still respect the other person enough to say, well, I disagree with you, but you're still a good person. I think that is really hard to do these days with social media and stuff like that. So I think it's a very important question.
Tagen. Yeah, I would agree with you on that, and with what you're saying about the importance of talking about interpersonal communication, and perhaps thinking about the way that we are talking about to other people. Buber specifically brings up the argument that our modern day, which, when he wrote this years and years and years ago, like this is a older text. But in his modern day, he even said, this was pre-social media, he said that this society is like fundamentally grounded in this I-it way of communication, and we are encouraged to communicate with each other in I-it fashion, in objectifying each other, looking at each other as tools for our purposes. He's talked about politics, like economics, like public institutions. All public life is fundamentally grounded in this I-it communication, and it's interesting to consider how possibly our modern day might have compounded this I-it type of communication. And one thing I do want to bring up, which is might not be entirely relevant to our conversation today, but Buber brings an existential consideration into the I-it forms of communication, in the sense that it leaves people with an existential angst, because we ultimately do require this type of meaningful communication with each other. And if we are unable to look at each other as human beings, and look at each other charitably and non-judgmentally, then it leaves us feeling groundless, and leaves us feeling lonely, and feelings of meaninglessness, and all these other things that are tied with existential philosophy. So Buber is considered an existential philosopher in this regard, and which is interesting, because most existential philosophers don't bring up a theory of dialogue, or a conception of dialogue the way he does. So he's very unique in that way. But I think that if we go on to talk about our institutions and all these other things in politics, and even modern day things like this, how would it change if we were to employ an I-thou form of communication, instead of trying to catch people, let's say, in aha moments, or trying to find the faults in somebody, or somebody's communication, or somebody's argument, or somebody's looks, or anything like that. Instead of trying to find the faults in people, what would it be like to truly communicate with each other charitably, non-judgmentally, and in a way that is like humanizing to them? Would that make us get to better points in our society, and actually go towards improvement?
So, could I interject something here, Nicole? I actually have the beginning of an answer to your question, but before I give my preliminary answer to that, I wanted to just go back just a little bit to my understanding about why it is that in our society, in our culture, we are so inclined to relate to other people as an it. And I know that in my philosophical education, there's been a lot of emphasis on the word experience. I experience this about the world. I experience that. And Buber actually talks about this. So I just want to read a couple paragraphs from the book, from the I and Thou book. He says, we are told that man experiences his world. What does this mean? Man goes over the surfaces of things and experiences them. He brings back from them some knowledge of their condition and experience. He experiences what there is to things. But it is not experiences alone that bring the world to man. For what they bring to him is only a world that consists of it, and it, and it, and he, and she, and she, and it. I experience something. So what Buber's talking about is, in my view, is this common viewpoint, in this fundamental viewpoint in at least in Eurocentric philosophy, a sort of analytic viewpoint of looking at the world and categorizing things and experiencing things as though they were static and as though I were an observer. And I think we can see this come out also in Bertrand Russell's project, which was to make a logical inventory of things in the world, right? And of course, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was a student of Russell's, finally diverged from Russell in this way, and Wittgenstein had a real objection to looking at the world as a static thing which you can inventory. So I think this is what Buber's trying to move away from, is this idea that we are observers detached from the world that we're observing. Even some of other rebellious philosophers, the deconstructionists, pointed this out. I think Deirdre and some others pointed out that it's actually impossible to be a observer because observers influence the things they're observing. And we can see this when a painter interacts with his or her subject. So the observer or the painter or the artist, in doing the observation or in doing the painting, actually is interacting and changing the thing that he or she is observing. And so Buber, I think, this is my interpretation, recognizes the error in the I-it viewpoint, in the idea that I am an observer simply experiencing things out there, because what Buber's getting is that the experience actually creates a relationship. And he starts to talk about that when he says, the world as experience belongs to the basic word I-it. But I-you, now he's moving on to I-you, and I know later he goes into I-thou, but I-you is a step up, because he says I-you establishes the world of relation. So he's trying to point us toward an understanding of a relationship that exists between people. So Nicole, you're not an it out there. Tagen, you're not an it, but there's a relationship happening, that it's an interactive two-way relationship. So I just wanted to point out that my understanding of some of the underlying theory here. And then I wanted to quickly answer your question to lead off into the discussion, the more practical discussion, which I think you wanted to go to, Nicole, it sounded like, with your question, about how does this understanding of relationship versus static experience, how does this actually, or how might it, what potential does it have to improve our relationships or improve the world even?
And the reason why I do bring up this point is because I think that is the fundamental objective of Martin Buber's work. He wants us to think about how we are communicating with each other in society, and be able to diagnose the issue that we are having with objectifying things, seeing things as objects, seeing people as objects. And I think that is his main goal and his main intention with his work. And even though he said that society at his time was using a predominantly I-it form of communication, I think that still rings true to today.
So here's one example, from the practical end, and then I'd love to hear you guys comment on how this relates back to Buber, if it does. I think it does. So in a practice called nonviolent communication, which was something started by a guy named Marshall Rosenberg, who he's contemporary. He died a few years ago. But one of the premises of nonviolent communication is that there are common needs that all people have. There are shared needs. And not only that, but people's behavior, what we do, our behavior is driven by our needs. So humans in this view, in Rosenberg's view, and I know that Rosenberg was influenced by Buber, and he said it explicitly. In this view, we are not atomic or atomized individuals out to get gain for ourselves, because we're actually all sharing the same needs, and it would be an error to use the Hobbesian view of the war of all against all, because we have shared needs. So rather than fight each other, why not view people as simply like us? Tagen, you're like me. Nicole, you're like me. We have common needs. And Rosenberg actually details what many of these needs are. We can talk about that. And so if we start to adjust our viewpoint to see that we are people like each other just trying to meet common needs, that casts things into a whole different perspective than the Hobbesian view of the war of all against all. Because we're like each other. So why not cooperate and understand each other as in relationship rather than as in opposition?
And one thing I do want to say is that I think we can use this conception from nonviolent communication that we all have needs and we're fundamentally, we act in certain ways to get our needs met. That can explain why people act in an I-it form of communication. If people are predominantly trying to get their needs met, and that's the reason for their communication, people might misinterpret the best way of communication as an I-it form of communication, which is an I-it form of communication would be defined as a way of communication that is looking at people as objects for your own personal use. So if you're looking at people in an objectifying way, how can I use them to meet my goals, to meet my ends? Like how can I, then that is a form of looking at people in a manner to meet your needs or our needs or all of our needs. And if we can find a way to reframe that way of meeting people's needs into an I-thou form of communication or nonviolent form of communication, I think that will be a great revelation that we can do.
Right, and the important point here is that by needs, I don't mean material needs so much. Many of our needs are needs that entail relationship with other people. So needs for connection, needs for love, needs for security. There's so many needs that people have that cannot be met alone. And that's why we have to understand needs not as a getting something for myself, but needs as building quality relationships, needs for community, needs for understanding, needs for respect, needs for appreciation, needs to be heard, needs to be acknowledged. All of these needs that I've just mentioned all require other people, not as objects, but as willing partners, as the thou, as a thou, as someone who's in relationship. And then it also emerges in nonviolent communication that the and this I also think comes from Buber. So Nicole, or Tagen, if you and I are friends or we're cooperating in some endeavor, there's more than two entities here. There's at least 3 entities, right? So there's you, there's me, and there's the relationship. And so Buber might say I, thou entails, when you use the word thou, it entails more than a you and a me as separate individuals trying to meet our own selfish needs, but rather we are, the relationship between us is what makes you a thou, and to you makes me a thou, is the dynamic relationship.
Yeah, I think if I can jump in here, I think there is, that's a good point. There is more than just the two. There is the there is that shared, there is that commonality, the relationship, as Mikey just pointed out. But I think, I think the one thing that's always stuck out to me about Buber, the one kind of paraphrased quote I'll always remember, and I think it's key, because what are relationships built out of but love for one another, care for one another? And Martin Buber talks about in a romantic relationship, but I think it could also be put into like just family relationships in general. The power of the "I love you" statement. That very statement comes from the core of a person's very being. That it, in a sense, he wouldn't say this, but I'll add this, that it transcends, because Buber says feelings are wonderful things, but feelings are entertained. That's not what love itself is. Love is something much deeper. It is a call for me to the other person, and it's a call to that love that we share between us that requires a response from the other. I think Buber, isn't it Buber that talks about reciprocity and the need for that? Nicole, you're kind of the expert on that.
I'm not an expert in Buber. I try to understand as much as possible as I can from him. But ultimately, even if he, stated the need for reciprocity explicitly or not, his whole philosophy does lend itself to being a philosophy of reciprocity. That's the whole underlying purpose of interpersonal communication, in the form of I, you, I, thou, seeing people as a person. You're not just looking at how you can benefit, which is a non-reciprocal type of conversation, but you're looking at how possibly the other person can benefit, but beyond that as well, right? So I-it communication is explicitly grounded in seeing how only you can benefit from that conversation. I, thou is much more than that. So that does lend itself to being a way of communication that does lend itself to reciprocity.
I guess another question I would have, Nicole, when you talk about the I-it relationship and kind of using that as an ends to a means, instead of an end in itself. Could you give a concrete example of what that might look like in terms of communication?
Thanks for bringing that up, Tagen. Yeah, that's a good. I should give an example. So there's many examples that I could talk about, but one example could be communicating with somebody only for the reason of having them do something for you. So one example of that could be, hey, Bobby, could you talk to this person for me? and you do, and with that you would be using them as a means to an end in, maybe getting that person to mediate between that, but you're not necessarily in that particular dialogue, you're not looking at that person's or Bobby's needs. But another way that you could be more as an I thou form of communication, you could say, "Hey Bobby, I would appreciate if you did this for me. However, I understand if you have other things going on. Let me know how I can help you as well, like in the future."
But
And it's more of like a, yeah.
yeah, but Nicole, I'm gonna play devil's advocate here. There are some people that would say, but there's nothing wrong with that kind of form of communication. And I mean, I understand why it's wrong, but maybe explain why. Because there are many situations in life, in a workplace, in professional capacities where that does happen. So
I think I take and you make a good point. I think I'm more going from my personal interpretation of Buber, not necessarily maybe what Buber would recommend, but the way I would go with his philosophy is that you should not be contacting or communicating with somebody purely in an I-it fashion,
right.
if it can be avoided. So let's say that you are in a situation, like it's hard with how our society is structured. Like, for example, if you want to go to the bank and you talk to a bank teller, they might be weirded out if you try to like talk to them, have a normal conversation with them or personal conversation with them. So it does have a little bit of like implications based on how our society is already structured. But like, let's say that you have a friend, and if you want that friend to do something for you, I think, like, from my personal interpretation of Buber and like how I would go, like how to actually use his philosophy, I would make a rule for myself. I would say, if I need to get something from them, I will make sure that I look at their needs and I respect their needs and their feelings, and I am not only communicating them with them for the purpose of getting my like goals met. So let's say, well, giving a figure, let's say maybe 80% of the time, you should be communicating with them in a personal fashion, and the rest of the time, perhaps you should be, then that will, maybe you will be allowed to have some leeway in asking them for help with something. But there has to be a bit of a balance. Like, I think it's problematic if you only talk to somebody to get your needs met and to get to your, I guess, for as a means to an end, to your end.
Right.
I think that is problematic. So there should be like a bit of a balance.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think what Buber is trying to accomplish is this reimagining of how we do interpersonal relationships, to see that, in some capacities there are going to be moments where relationships are going to be pretty much as far as it goes. There are going to be moments like that, but for the ones we're closest to be intentional to the fact where we communicate in such a way that we acknowledge each other, whether that's as fellow human beings or in whatever capacity it is. I think Buber's point is not to necessarily take away the individual complexities of communication, but it is to try and break down that hard set focus on the individual versus focus on, yes, the individual, but also the people around them. To say that it is only because of those relationships, or it is because of those relationships, you draw value from that relationship. So to be reciprocal and intentional. I don't know. Does that make sense?
I think like what you would, I think a good summary of that is when you say going away from the individual, it's more of like you as the individual and only seeing you as the individual, not the other person as an individual as well. So like communication would be you're looking at your individual needs, but you're not like looking at the other person's individual needs. So like thou communication would make sure that you're also looking at the other person's needs and considering them. So like I guess when we're talking about applicability here with Martin Buber's philosophy, I don't think that we can go into the world right now and completely apply everything that he's talking about and not get like weird looks from people, because we've lived in a society for so long that it's been structured in a way to make things, businessy, and like if you go into a store and you want to buy something, you can't really have a conversation with the cashier about like their family if you don't know them, right? We live in like that, we have those restrictions. But I think within those restrictions, I think that we should take a second out of our day, or a few seconds out of our day, whenever we're talking to somebody, to analyze and see if there's an opportunity to truly connect with that person on an individual level, on a personal level. Even if we don't know that person, you could say that if we're going to the store and we're going to talk to a cashier, instead of just like kind of looking at our phone, here, scan my items, let me pay. Maybe you can say, hi, how are you doing? How was your day? Like, just like, maybe I think that you doing just small things like that, it is going towards Buber's philosophy. We cannot reasonably enact everything about his philosophy right now with the way that our society is structured, but we can move towards that, and we can have his conception of true interpersonal communication, like wherever we go, as a long-term goal. But we do need to make sure, I think, or it would be a good goal just to takes time out of our day, and whenever we're communicating with somebody, try to find small opportunities to just connect with them, and not just see somebody as an object of, your goals and whatever you're trying to achieve. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Let me just relate back to what I was saying before about, and then you picked up on this, Nicole, about thou being the needs of thou being my needs, because there's another entity here, which is the relationship between us, and that relationship entails a merging of needs, because if all parties' needs aren't being met, then that relationship suffers. So that's how your needs are also my needs, because there's a relationship, and the relationship is a need of mine, in that I have a need for connection and for companionship and for love and all those things, and for friendship and all those things. So one of the principles in nonviolent communication that Marshall Rosenberg articulated is, and this is very important, is that needs never conflict. Only strategies to meet those needs conflict. So how does that relate to Buber? Needs not only do they not conflict, but they're not specific to person, time, or place. And these are fundamental differences, I think, that, if you think about it in a profound way, than what we are used to, how we are used to thinking in our culture. It's so common. I mean, it's romanticized in pop culture. I need you. I need your love. I'm nothing without you. These are totally contrary concepts to what Buber teaches, because thou entails, among other things, it entails your autonomy. So Nicole, when I view you, when I relate to you as a thou, you are an autonomous person. I don't need you. I don't need you to be a certain way, because you're an autonomous person. And if I need you, or I try and manipulate you, or pressure you, or guilt trip you, or shame you, or wrong you, or judge you, in the hopes that I can make you into the thing that I think I need you to be, then you're an it. You're an it. And I'm trying to make you the it that I want you to be. But if you're a thou, you're an autonomous person, and I can make requests, I can communicate with you and express my desires, but I cannot expect that you will accommodate me and be the way that I desire you to be. And what that means is that I have to have a plan B. I have to be able to rely upon myself to find other strategies to meet my needs if you aren't able, as an autonomous thou, to do what I want you to do. And needs never conflict. So if you're a person with needs and I'm a person with needs, those are all legitimate needs. And if we want to enter into an mutual I-thou relationship and be friends or relate, then it's incumbent upon us to develop strategies to meet both of our needs. And that's another way of looking at this, another explanation of why the idea behind all people trying to meet their needs is not a Hobbesian view, but rather it's a cooperative view.
Thanks for bringing that up, Mikey. I think that I would relate to what you talked about in relation to making people an I-it, making them fit your needs, forcing them to fit your needs. I would relate that to scientific inquiry. And I would say that in scientific inquiry, if we are trying to see whatever phenomena we're trying to study as an I-it, as an object, we run the risk of placing our desires onto that phenomena and not looking at that phenomena as a phenomena in itself, a thou in itself. And this is Buber actually goes into this in his book I and Thou. He goes beyond talking about people, and he talks about inanimate objects and looking at inanimate objects as a thou. And this example with the scientists, this really illustrates that point, because there's all these issues regarding scientific integrity and p-hacking and all these controversies in science. And all those controversies, or most of those controversies, I would say specifically in p-hacking and trying to cherry pick and all those other issues, that is in relation to trying to look at phenomena as an I-it. You're trying to force that phenomena to fit your motive, to fit your goal. And you're not looking at that phenomena as what it actually is in itself, trying to see it, I guess, as neutrally or objectively as we can see that. And that is where I-thou can come into to communicating or looking or interacting with objects. A second thing I want to bring up before we today is the value of I-thou communication in communicating with people that we disagree with. That could be in interpersonal communications, that could be in politics, that could be in activism. How should we communicate with people that we disagree with, and how can possibly I-thou change the landscape of how we talk to people that we disagree with? And I personally believe that if we try to see people as a human being and as people who need to get their needs met, and just like we do, that will bring a sense of commonality, and that will make things less inflammatory and adversarial. Because I do firmly believe in, I guess, my personal philosophy that we need to be charitable, and we need to be accommodating, and we need to be understanding of each other on a personal level in order to make progress in discussions where we don't agree with each other. And I think that I-thou communication can really come into play and make things not so inflammatory, and instead of attacking each other or judging each other, we can instead put that energy towards coming up with solutions to our problems.
It's true, Nicole. The atmosphere in which we are living right now is tense, whether that be politically, maybe even personally, depending on how everyone's doing. The art of say you're in a political debate, for example, and it's very easy when things aren't going, your position's away, to start attacking the individual, to say, well, you just don't get it, do you? Or sometimes much harsher, looking at you, Facebook. But the trick is to see the person behind the argument, to see that there is a story there, that there is human emotions there, that might be fueling their position, whether you agree with it or not. There is a story there, and so to uncover that is key. Just as with the example I gave earlier, before they made the assumption that, oh well, he has a disability, he must have all the time in the world. They didn't really take notice of who the person was they were speaking to. They didn't take notice to how I interacted with them. And so it is, and I think it comes back to intentionality, that we need to have intention in our interactions, to, in small ways, recognize fellow humanity, to recognize that person, even as you say, in the grocery store, maybe looking up and flashing a smile or something, even as they're bagging your groceries, to say, hey, I appreciate you. Maybe not in that direct of a way, but to make a gesture that acknowledges their individuality and autonomy.
So, nonviolent communication uses the term empathy to describe what you're getting at, Nicole. So, when there's a conflict, we're tempted in our culture to judge and wrong the other person and argue. And then you wind up arguing past each other. So in nonviolent communication, and I believe what Buber was getting at, is that it's not useful to argue right and wrong. What's useful is to try and understand and empathize with the other person. So in nonviolent communication, there's very practical methods using a certain structure, which we can't get into now, to actually aid, to assist in conflict resolution. And it involves not proving who's right, but it involves trying to understand the other person's feelings and needs, and coming up with strategies to meet everyone's needs. It's a very different approach, but it's in the spirit of I and thou.
Mm-hmm.
I think your Nicole, your recommendations about acknowledging the humanity of even a clerk in a store or something, or a cashier, I think those are all very valuable, and I think it even goes a lot deeper than that. I had a relative, an uncle that traveled a lot, and he said that the way you get things done, and when you're at airline counters and you're dealing with paper pushers and bureaucrats and people that are just trying to get their job done, you just stand there and you refuse to move until they do what you want them to do, and you make it easier for them to do what you want than it is for them to ignore you. And I can't say with any more I can't stress any more than I am right now that this is so contrary bless his memory, my uncle, it's so contrary to what Buber teaches, which is, if if I'm hoping to relate to get my needs for met, which include my needs for a safer and better world, and connection with people, and peace and not war, then when I'm dealing with even a clerk or someone, there's got to be some way that I can find the humanity in that person and empathize with that person. I understand it must be you're having a tough day, or I understand that this is overwhelming. Are you feeling overwhelmed right now? And so that's the first step here, I think, is trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes before you argue with them and say that they're wrong. Does that relate to Buber, do you think, you guys? Is that what Buber's trying to say? That part of it?
I would think that relates to him, because I think if you are too quick to judge people and try to say, oh, you're wrong, or here's why you're wrong, that is a form of objectifying that person, because you're not taking the time to see what their perspective is. You're not giving it. Like, I think that you can have a conversation about maybe why somebody might be wrong in one regard, but you have to do it in a reasonable and reciprocal manner, and not go towards it with the goal of making your ego, inflating your ego, or try to win the argument, because then you are definitely making that person an object. You're trying to make them an object of, I will use this person to win an argument, and that is not that is against Buber's philosophy.
So wrong is a label that you attach to an it, but what can we do to understand each other and find a win-win, actually win-win-win solution? You win, I win, and the relationship wins. What can we do? That's an I-thou situation, the way I'm putting it all together here. We only have about another minute. Any final thoughts, Tagen or Nicole?
Buber's primary aim is to redefine how we view each other. Buber's primary aim is to, in our relationships, how do we enter into a state where we're not looking for strictly how they can benefit us. As my colleagues have illustrated, the idea, I need you, it's more like, I benefit from you, and I thank you for that. What can I do for you in return?
Thank you. Tagen Marshall of Vancouver Island University. Nicole, any thoughts in summary?
I'm very grateful that we're able to talk about this today, because I think that communication is not often regarded as a philosophical concept, but I think that that there is room for talking about interpersonal communication in the philosophical community, because it directly relates to ethics. And if we're talking about concepts like autonomy and respect for autonomy, then we need to also talk about how we communicate with people in order to respect their autonomy.
Great point. Thank you, Nicole Kirigin of Simon Fraser University. My name is Michael Robert Caditz. I hope you've been enjoying our show, the Canadian Philosophy Show, a weekly program which is aired on CHLY Nanaimo, streamed on chly.ca. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And thank you, YouTube viewers. I think we have a couple, hopefully. One or two. So I'm going to end the YouTube.